Hey, Shalom and welcome. This is Just a Dad in a Bible. Hey, welcome back to Just a Dad in a Bible. I am Gaspar Cortez. I'm not a pastor, not a chaplain, not an ordained priest, but I'm here to teach the Bible. I absolutely love this word that we call the Bible, right? Everything that is in it has been given to us by God. And I think it's an amazing book. But with that, again, a little about the ministry. This is going to be a show from a Messianic perspective. Maybe not full-on Messianic, because Messianic just means follower of Christ, right? Follower, believer. If it's not in the Bible, I probably will try not to teach on it. I might get into it as questions start to come in future episodes and whatnot. But with that, again, like I said, Messianic perspective. So more likely from a Jewish perspective, New Testament, Old Testament. Jesus was Jewish, right? So that's the perspective we're going to go with. I teach the Bible from a literal prophetic perspective, meaning that if it's not in the Bible, and I usually will take what the Bible says for it. Obviously, there's analogy, there's metaphor, there's all sorts of, all types of literature in here, and most people don't understand it, and that seems to be a really big problem in life today. Another part of the show is we're going to go over some current events and how we as followers and believers should react and or not react to it, right? There are some things we don't even need to talk about, some things we don't even need to go over, but yet some of the church, they get into these things that are not necessarily needed. And then finally, I'll give some thoughts for the day, maybe some things that went on this week in my life, or maybe something that I saw in somebody else's life and I thought we should talk about. But as for that, right, this first episode that we're in today, we're going to go over the Book of James. I absolutely love the Book of James. It is something completely different than most of the books in the Bible. Whereas Paul teaches faith before salvation, James, Yaakov teaches us faith after salvation. What are we supposed to do with our faith? But anyways, so while we're getting into it, right, let's go over the preliminary context before we actually get into the Bible itself. So the author, obviously, as we know, is Yaakov or James. He was the half-brother of Yeshua. His nickname is Yaakov HaTzedek, or James the Just. He is actually the head of the Sanhedrin at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. For some reason, most people will think that Peter is the head of the church. That's actually false. I don't know. I understand where it comes from and whatnot, right? Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Unfortunately, that's taken way out of context, and that's not exactly what Yeshua is talking about. But we do see in Acts 15 that the final decree comes from the half-brother of Jesus, right? It comes from the head of the Sanhedrin, or what they would have known for the Sanhedrin at that time. And one of the funny things, right, is like most believers, or like most of the apostles, like most of the disciples that came right out, right, when Jesus was there, they weren't exactly believers yet. It took all of them pretty much until the resurrection, right? Until after the resurrection, not many of them were believers. And then that happens, right? John 7:5. And next thing you know it, they're believers. I can understand why it would take something like that to happen. I could understand it. It happens, right? But moving on from there, right? Yaakov was a big pillar in the church. He did a lot of things that we should take and listen to, especially coming out of this particular book that we're going to get into over the next few episodes. The book was probably written before 62 AD when he was martyred. We don't have a confirmed date. Most people believe it's probably the first book written from the New Testament. Some say, because there's no mention of circumcision, that it would have been before the council in AD 49. Others would also add that it was written for those dispersed in Acts 8, right, during the persecution. No one really knows, and that's one of those things. It could have been any time, to be honest, from 30 AD, close to his death in 62 AD. And my reasoning will be explained in his purpose, really, which leads me to the next thoughts, right? Purpose and theme. This book is not a defense of the truth. It assumes you already know the basics of the faith again, right? Like I said, Paul is faith before salvation. James is faith after salvation. The purpose I get from reading James is to challenge the believer after salvation. What are you doing with your salvation? Are we living out our salvation by producing works, good fruit, because of our faith? What are you doing with your faith? Our faith is demonstrated by our conduct. Think about what Yeshua says about good fruit. Matthew 7, 16 through 20. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth the evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. Think about that. That's pretty big to kind of take in there, right? Most believers, I wouldn't say most believers, but there's a lot of people in the church today who don't produce good fruit. And the problem with that is it probably starts in the pulpit, right? It starts with their pastors and what they're teaching them these days. For the most part, I know most people won't like this. They'll probably actually have a problem with this, but the majority of pastors out there today are teaching a lawless gospel. They're not teaching a gospel that Yeshua preached. They're definitely not teaching a gospel that Yeshua was following and walking, right? If we're supposed to imitate Yeshua as Paul did, that would be following the commands of God. We'll get into it later, like I said, but even in the book of Revelation, right? It's pretty much proven that it's the commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua. So it's full Bible, right? Genesis to Revelation. Moving on here, right? Just some quick notes before we get started. This book is similar to the Proverbs in the Tanakh, and rightfully so. It may not contrast as much as Shalom or Solomon did in the Proverbs, but Yaakov's consistent focus on practical action caused by our faith is very reminiscent of the wisdom we read in the Proverbs. As we will see, Yaakov pushes us to be the set-apart children we as believers are supposed to be. Again, going back to what I just said prior to some of the quick notes, right? If we're not set apart in the church or the assembly today, then who are we? We're similar to all the pagan nations, right? They do all the same things that we do. Even they can be nice to their children. Even they can be nice to others. So what sets the church or the assembly apart other than saying they have faith in God? And again, that's the reason I'm starting off with the book of James, is because it shows you that exactly what James says, right? Show me your faith and I'll show you my faith by my works, by what I'm doing with my faith. James is Jewish. He draws upon his Jewish background consistently, using references from the Tanakh more than 50 times in this book alone. He employs Hebrew idioms. He is concerned with the Jewish diaspora and uses Jewish terms to connect with them. And lastly, this book is similar to an acid test. I've heard that a few times from a few ministries, and I think that's absolutely spot on. This book is an acid test, right? What are you doing with your fruit? Are you corrupting it, or are you proving to be set apart with the Spirit of God? This particular book shows who is genuine and who is fake. And obviously we're speaking of the believer, right? We're not speaking of the unbeliever. We already know who the unbeliever is, kind of thing. They don't profess to be a Christian. They don't. When it comes to it, we can already see the compromisation or the compromise that they have from this. I truly believe this book shows inadvertently why, or the real reason why most people or atheists do not take Jews and Christians seriously, right? Most Jews and Christians say and don't do. Think about that for a second. That's a problematic issue we have in today's life. You might have actually heard this from a few different ministries and whatnot, but I absolutely love this quote. It comes from Gandhi when asked about the Messiah and why he uses so many quotes from him, from Yeshua. And his reply should hit most Christians in the church today and most Jewish people in the synagogues or the assembly today, right in the heart and right in the feels, and should get to you. Quote, when asked, "I like your Messiah, but not your Christians. They are unlike your Messiah." It's absolutely, it's spot on and on point. Are we doing exactly what we need to do as followers, as believers in Yeshua? I admit it. I'm not perfect in any way. There's some things I'm probably lacking on, but hopefully and Lord willing, we can all get there. We can all become the believers we need to be. Now here comes the greatest question of our lifetime. Why are the so-called believers not like the Messiah? And to answer that question, let's open up the book of Yaacov and James, right? Let's read verse 1:1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Messiah Yeshua, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. It's only the first verse, and it's packed with so much that most people don't even think about it. They just read right through it and go and start getting into the rest of the chapter here. The problem is this verse can be broken down so much just for an opening, right? So that's what we're going to go over tonight, is pretty much this verse in the introduction. And then we'll go through some current events, whether we should react to them, or even go over them, right? And then just some thoughts that I have. So anyways, going into verse 1:1 here. Yaakov opens up something I believe is missed by most people. First, he is a servant of Elohim. The Western world misses this true definition. The definition of the word servant. The Greek, doulos, defines the word as slave, properly someone who belongs to another, a bondslave without any ownership rights of their own. And second, he serves Yeshua, the Messiah. He is imitating Messiah. He is trying to lead by example. This reminds me of Revelation, where it constantly says the commandments of Yud-He Vav-He, right, of Elohim, and the testimony of Messiah Yeshua. Not one or the other. It's both. It's always both. Every time you hear it in Revelation, one of the most important books that we'll ever read in our lifetime as believers. And like I said, it just slips right over the minds of so many believers. But again, this is why I think Jews and Christians today don't follow either or, right? One follows the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and the other follows just nothing but the Brit Chadashah, right? Just the New Testament. And that, we can't have that. We have to have some sort of meeting in between to understand that they're both the same thing. What Paul preaches, what James preaches, what John preaches, what all these New Testament disciples and apostles are preaching is the same exact thing that all the prophets preached about in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, in the Torah, right? And it's a really big problem that we have today. And how can we bring that back together? Because until that happens, right? Until believers look up and really search for God, it's not going to happen. But I think that time is coming soon. But back to what I was saying, right? Most people have chosen, they really have. They have chosen to ignore one half of the book of the Bible because of years of misinterpretation. We can go back to early 300s, because that's when everything sort of started to change, right? When they started to put in the edicts, and they were meeting at these and getting creeds out. The Council of Nicaea and some councils shortly after that. They started changing laws and times, right? That's not a good thing, but somehow they accepted it, even though they were warned in the book of Daniel about that. But again, I think most people choose to ignore either the first or the second half because of years of misinterpretation, and most likely because one of the worst things that we're going to have as a reason for not believing either or is because, well, my pastor or my rabbi said so. Not because you were being the Berean and checking to make sure it was so, but because your pastor or because your rabbi said so. Again, that might make some people angry, but too bad, right? We're here to really get into what this word says. And then finally, in this particular verse, we see the intended audience that Yaakov is writing to. To the 12 tribes scattered abroad, or in some versions, the dispersion. The 12 tribes were all Jewish, which would lead us to believe what is coming in the rest of the book is more than likely going to have some or more than enough Jewish concepts to make someone understand that it's coming from a Jewish background. Again, right over some people's heads. It's going to happen. And I can understand it. I can understand why people do that, right? Peter tells us most people are going to take Paul out of context. It's going to happen. And we'll get into that later in my final thoughts. So the 12 tribes were all Jewish, which would lead us to believe, again, what is coming in the rest of the book, more than likely, also at the same time, not only Jewish, but Torah-centric. Again, there were 50 plus references in the book of James. I can't count them all, and I haven't found them all, but I know there's more than 50 according to most scholars who will agree on that it's a Torah-centric book. So the 12 tribes could have a few meanings. It could be Jews dispersed at the time, or Jews dispersed in previous years, right? Because we know that the Jewish people were dispersed long time ago back in the Old Testament, right? In the Tanakh. Some people would say that they're the Jewish people dispersed from when Paul was going after everybody in Acts 7 and 8, right? At the death of Stephen, all the Jewish people dispersed through the lands. Or it could just be to the Jews everywhere, since all Jewish people would have come from or descended from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Whether you're grafted in, whether we've been adopted in, whatever the case may be, we're still from those 12 tribes. And believe me, adoption is real. But the problem is where is the root? Most people forget about what the root of the tree is. The root of the tree is Torah believing, right? Jesus was Torah believing. Moses, Torah believing, right? If you had believed Moses, you'd believe Yeshua. Problem is most people in the church today don't even believe Moshe. They just say, oh, it's good words and that's it. Or it's good literature to read upon. We should possibly look at it and we can live better lives because of it. Not actually follow them, right? They pick and choose and they draw out that black line on the sheet of paper, right? Redact. But that happens. But anyways, it's like I said, it's the evidence for a Jewish audience is to the 12 tribes, right? The congregation still meets in synagogues later on in chapter 2. There's the Hebrew title, Lord Sabaoth, in 5:4. And he talks to the brethren or brothers, and that's used in 2:1, 5:7, and 8. Yet for some reason, when he says brethren or brothers, most people take it as like Gentile believers somehow. I don't understand it, but that's what, in some of the research I've done, that's exactly what they believe. But again, I just wanted to get into that first verse to start. Like I said, it's my first episode. Hopefully a lot more. I'm hoping to get much better at my speaking. That's the whole reason I wanted to do this. But at the same time, I'm tired of pastors out there trying to use context, right? That's what the whole basis of going to college, learning, getting a theology degree, doing all these things, right? They preach on context, yet they skip over what they believe is not within that context, right? Like we go to Acts 15. Acts 15, what do they give? They give 3 different decrees, all from Leviticus, all from the Tanakh, saying we must do this in order to become a believer and not necessarily convert. Maybe it was to convert. And then what does he say in the very end of it, right? He says, and then don't worry about the rest, right? Let them cleanse their temple first, the body. Let them cleanse their body from the pagan ways that they had. And then they will be going to Sabbath, right? They'll be coming to Sabbath. They'll be going to synagogue, and they'll learn the rest slowly. How do you not see that, right? Again, what was Stephen stoned for? They said he was not following the words of Moshe. And in your book, in your Bible, in the book of Acts, it actually states he was falsely accused of this. That's absolutely unreal to have most people accept, or not even accept, but look right over that. It's the same thing with Paul, right? He's accused how many times? And every single time he's accused of not following the words of Moses, he defends following the words of Moses. So I would say if you're looking at something in Romans, Galatians, right, Colossians, you're probably misinterpreting what he's saying if you're saying he's done away with certain things. Because Romans 3:31, one of the greatest verses there is. And I know I'm going on a rant right here, but he says that we shall establish Torah. If you're not establishing Torah, then I don't know exactly what you're doing. I guess those are some of the thoughts for the day that I have. But some current events and how we should react or not react to them. I don't know. Some of the thoughts that I have, some current events that are going on right now. Obviously, we know what's going on in the world, right? We have this virus going around. I don't want to get banned on my first episode, so we won't talk about it much. But as believers, stay strong in the faith, right? A man once told me, smart guy, what you allow in your presence becomes your standard. So what you allow, right? If you're supposed to be a believer, if you're supposed to be a Christian, if you're supposed to be Jewish, there are certain things that you should not follow because they're ungodly ways, right? Don't take Romans 13 out of context. Paul says we listen to the state, right? Because God put them there. However, if what they say goes against what God says, we do not follow it. That's called compromise. Everywhere in the Bible, we're told not to compromise against God's word. That's why there's so much punishment going on in the world today. Some other current events, right? Weather. I would like to pray for a lot of those out there. I'm not going to pray in front of you guys. We're not. God tells us to go into our closets and then pray, right? That's where he'll hear us. So I would, after this video or whenever you have time, right, go into your prayer closet and pray. Sorry, not play, but I mean, it could be playing, right? If we're happy with God, right? That's our playtime, right? Our praying with God, getting closer to him and doing what we need to do as believers. Again, the reason I named the ministry 1 Thessalonians 5:17 is because I'm always trying to pray as much as I can. I try to talk with God and I'm trying to ask him, right? Because if we ask, seek, and knock, and we ask the proper things, it should be given to us. But with that, I want to thank you all for enjoying this first episode. Like I said, it's not too long. I just wanted to go over one verse and introduce who I was. I would hope and pray for all of you out there. I'm asking you all to really start thinking about your prayer game. You probably need to beef that up a little. We really need it in today's day and age. We really need some more prayer. So with that, shalom, blessings. And again, thank you for watching this episode if you made it all the way through. Have a good evening.